In exactly 50 days, Vladimir Putin will achieve something that no Russian leader has accomplished since Joseph Stalin. He will have led Russia through a war that lasted longer than the entire Second World War. The Great Patriotic War, as Russians call it. The conflict that cost 27 million Soviet lives, that shaped Russian identity for generations, that Russians commemorate every single year with parades and solemn remembrance. That war lasted 3 years and 10 months. Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which was supposed to take 3 days, will soon have lasted longer than that. And tonight, I can tell you that the cracks are finally showing. Not at the front lines, though there are cracks there too. No, I'm talking about something potentially more significant. The Russian economy is hemorrhaging, and for the first time, the people paid to lie about it are telling the truth on state television. Russian propagandists are panicking on camera about money. When that happens, you pay attention. So let me show you what's actually unfolding inside Russia right now, because it is extraordinary. First, the bleeding. Russian oil and gas revenue, and understand, this is the heartbeat of the entire Russian state, has collapsed by more than 20% this year alone. But November, the first full month after the latest Western sanctions hit, revenue dropped 34%. December is tracking toward 50% losses. Half their oil money gone. Now, will Russia eventually find workarounds? Probably. They always try. But sanctions work like a noose around an economy. Each new round pulls tighter. Russia can still breathe, but every breath gets harder. And while Moscow scrambles for loopholes, the price of Russian oil has simultaneously crashed 18% since October. Less oil sold, less money per barrel. That combination is devastating for a petrostate. But here's where this becomes a human catastrophe, not just an economic statistic. Nearly 40% of working Russians now report they cannot afford food and basic necessities before their next paycheck. 4 in 10 workers in a supposed superpower are going hungry. The government's response? They moved the goalposts. Russia now claims record low poverty rates, just 6.5% below the poverty line. Sounds impressive until you learn the poverty line is set at $213 per month. That's the trick, right? The old joke about the flood? The water keeps rising, so the mayor shows up and moves the danger marker higher on the bridge. Problem solved. Statistically, anyway. Meanwhile, people are drowning. And speaking of drowning, let me tell you about what's happening in Russia's hospitals. This is where the war comes home in the most brutal way imaginable. In the Kamchatka region, authorities had promised residents a new hospital building. Then, the war started. The entire budget got redirected to military operations. Now, ordinary Russians are receiving treatment in facilities that are literally falling apart. Walls crumbling, toilets clogged for months, with repair requests denied. Parents with sick children forced to walk down freezing stairwells to find working bathrooms. This is not an isolated incident. This is a pattern. According to Russian state newspapers themselves, their own media, 60% of Russian regions now cannot balance their budgets. They've spent the money on signing bonuses for soldiers, on recruitment quotas set by the Kremlin, on Putin's war. And now there's nothing left for hospitals, roads, schools, or basic services. The regional deficit has exploded to 600 billion rubles, 11 times higher than when the invasion began in 2022. Now, I need you to understand why this is happening. Because the incentive structure Putin created is absolutely destroying Russia from the inside. When Putin took power, he changed how local governance works. Regional governors and local officials are no longer elected by their constituents. They're appointed directly by the Kremlin. Think about what that means. These officials don't answer to the people they govern. They answer to Putin. Their job security depends entirely on pleasing Moscow. not on whether schools function or hospitals stay open. So, when the Kremlin sets recruitment quotas, these governors raid their local budgets to offer massive signing bonuses. Hit your numbers, keep your job. Miss them, get replaced. The hospitals, the roads, the schools, those don't factor into performance reviews. Recruitment numbers do. This is why we're seeing something almost unthinkable. Russian officials publicly telling citizens they should have defended their own homes. In Kursk, after Russian forces bombarded the region to push out Ukrainian troops, Putin promised residents compensation for destroyed homes. Those payments aren't coming. When desperate residents gathered to protest, a government advisor told them point blank they should have defended themselves. The woman who confronted this official on camera demanding answers was detained. The news coverage of the protest was scrubbed from local channels. Let that sink in. This is a government that sent its own missiles into its own territory, destroyed its own citizens' homes, promised compensation, reneged on that promise, blamed the victims, and then arrested them for complaining. And the betrayals keep coming. Remember those enormous bonuses that convinced many Russians to sign military contracts? The life-changing sums that were supposed to make soldiers instant millionaires in rubles? The government is now clawing that money back. Soldiers who were promised millions of rubles arrived at the front lines in October only to discover the money had been reversed out of their bank accounts. Gone. Taken back by the same government that used those promises to recruit them. You do not want to be a government that breaks financial promises to men holding weapons. That is historically a very dangerous game to play. Now, before I continue, if you're finding this coverage valuable, please take a second to subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. It genuinely helps more people see this reporting, and trust me, there's much more to come tonight. Here's perhaps the most revealing moment in all of this. Russian state television, propaganda television, the channel that exists specifically to tell Russians everything is wonderful, aired a segment where a prominent commentator essentially had a breakdown about the economy. And I want you to understand what he said, because this is extraordinary. He asked his audience, where do we get money if our economy isn't growing? Where do we create jobs? If companies operate at losses, they'll cut staff. If they cut staff, meeting social obligations becomes impossible. Where will the state find money if we aren't generating it? This is a propagandist, someone literally paid to project strength and confidence, publicly questioning the entire economic foundation of the Russian state on television. But he went further. He pointed out that when Russian officials visit China, Chinese growth is higher. When they visit India, Indian growth is higher. He asked whether anyone has ever heard Chinese or Indian financial leaders say that growth is harmful and should be slowed down. Then he said something stunning. He called the Russian government's economic messaging, and I'm quoting him directly here, absolute newspeak. A Kremlin propagandist used the word newspeak, George Orwell's term, for authoritarian doublespeak to describe his own government's economic policy on state television. When you've lost your own propagandists, something fundamental has broken. And this brings me to something else that's breaking: the Russian narrative about this war itself. Another propagandist went on air recently to make a startling admission. He noted that in a few weeks, this war will have lasted as long as the Great Patriotic War against Nazi Germany. And he asked a devastating question: why haven't we achieved the same results? His answer was even more revealing. He said the problem isn't at the front, it's in the rear. Not everyone in Russia is fighting this war. The supreme commander is fighting. The government is fighting. The governors are fighting. But further down, people are worried about spoiling the mood during the New Year holiday. This is a propagandist admitting on state television that Russian society is not fully mobilized, not fully committed, not behind this war the way Russians were behind the fight against Hitler. Of course, what he conveniently forgets is that Russia only survived World War II because of massive American military aid. That's the part Russian history books don't emphasize anymore. The tanks, the trucks, the food, the equipment that came through Lend-Lease, that's what kept the Soviet Union in the fight. Russia doesn't have that this time. This time, American equipment is going to the other side. So, where does all of this leave us? Russia wants this war to end. Make no mistake about that. The economic pressure is real. The domestic strain is mounting. The cracks in the narrative are widening. But they want it to end on their terms. They want Ukraine to surrender. They want the West to back down. They want to claim victory despite everything. That's why they project strength even as they're bleeding out economically. That's why the propaganda continues even as propagandists break ranks. That's why Putin keeps throwing bodies at the front lines even as he can't pay for hospitals at home. The ancient strategist Sun Tzu wrote, "Appear strong when you are weak." That is the Russian playbook right now. Every claim of battlefield success, every dismissal of Western sanctions, every assertion that Russia can sustain this indefinitely, it's performance. It's theater. It's designed to convince Ukraine and the West to give up before Russia's internal contradictions tear the country apart. But the numbers don't lie. The propagandists are cracking. The regions are broke. The soldiers aren't getting paid. The hospitals are crumbling. The poverty statistics are being manipulated so aggressively that the manipulation itself has become obvious. 1/3 of Russians don't even have indoor plumbing. This is a country that claims superpower status, but has living standards comparable to Mexico. And this year, those living standards have fallen dramatically because every available ruble is being fed into a war machine that was supposed to achieve victory in 72 hours. 3 years and 10 months later, victory is nowhere in sight, and the Russian economy is paying the price. The question now is simple. How long can this continue? How long before the domestic pressure becomes unsustainable? How long before the propaganda stops working, even on those who want to believe it? We don't know the answers yet, but tonight we know something important. The foundation is cracking. The people paid to hide that fact are admitting it publicly. And 50 days from now, Putin's quick little special military operation will have officially lasted longer than Russia's most sacred war. History has a way of delivering its verdicts, and history is watching Russia very closely right now. That's all for tonight. I'll see you tomorrow.